letters, legal dramas, religion, and having a boss who was apparently literally worse than Nero. It's time to look at Pliny the Younger, his life and letters, all on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome. My name's Neil, and in this episode, or Pliny-sode, oh come on, you can give me that one, I'll be talking about Pliny the Younger and his letters and his life. Now, there are a lot of letters, 368 in total, so what I'll be doing is focusing on some of the more famous ones, in particular his account of the eruption of Vesuvius which he witnessed, and what to do with a small but problematic religious sect called the Christians. I'll also be giving an overview of his life and other letters which cover a range of topics. Before I start, the standard fare of pointing you in my direction. I'm on Blue Sky, TikTok, X, Instagram and YouTube as Ancient Blogger. There's also a subreddit for this podcast called Ancient History Hound, which is also my name on Reddit. Finally, my website, which will have episode notes, which will include a transcript, supporting content, and a list of sources I have used. One book gets a special mention, In the Shadow of Vesuvius by Daisy Dunn. I bought this as part of my research, and it's a great read about Pliny the Younger and much, much more. Thanks again for those reviews and ratings which have been coming in on Spotify, but don't forget Apple Podcasts. If you listen on that platform, and in fact on any other platform, please leave me a rating or review. You may not know this, but these give my podcast more exposure and results in it being suggested to a wider group of people. For an indie podcaster with absolutely no marketing budget, it's really what I rely on. But of course, thanks for all the listeners who are returning to listen to more. Okay then, let's begin. Lake Como sits south of the Italian Alps and north of modern-day Milan. It's a picturesque location, and we may know it today as a place where many celebs and A-listers have stayed for those breathtaking views across the lake and the hills. Keeping with the theme of celebrity, it was a sort of celebrity who founded a colony on the southern shore of the lake in 59 BC. The colony was called Novum Comum, and the celebrity of sorts, well, that was Julius Caesar. In either AD 61 or 62, Gaius Caecilius Secundus was born, or as we more commonly know him, Pliny the Younger. His parents were wealthy and from the equestrian class. His father, Lucius, died early in Pliny's life, leaving him to be brought up by his mother, Plinia, and a guardian, Virginius Rufus. Pliny seems to have felt a great deal for Rufus. He speaks of him very fondly in his letters. As a young boy, Pliny had a private tutor and seems to have been a very capable student, writing a Greek tragedy at the age of 14. Pliny wasn't the only Pliny in Novum Comum, far from it. Pliny the Elder was Pliny's brother, and thus Pliny the Younger's uncle. He too played an important role in the life of the younger Pliny, though in AD 70 this was put on pause, as he was made procurator and as a result had to travel the empire. However, we know that the pair were spending time together in AD 79 because of the eruption of Vesuvius. The two letters by Pliny covering the eruption of Vesuvius are possibly the most famous of his letters. In these, he described the actions of his uncle, the elder Pliny, and his own experience of the event. What you may not know is why he came to write the letters in the first place. It wasn't because of the eruption as such. Some 30 years after the event, the historian Tacitus sent him a letter. The request was to find out how his uncle died, as Tacitus was interested in this, presumably because Pliny the Elder was a famous person in his own right. Pliny's first letter outlined the events, how he and his uncle were staying at Misenum. This was in the northwestern part of the Bay of Naples, and it was where his uncle was stationed, as he was in charge of a Roman fleet there. His account begins with his mother pointing out to a strange cloud rising from Vesuvius, which Pliny described as like a pine tree. His uncle decided to investigate, and as he was making ready, he received a note from some friends asking for help in evacuating them. Pliny the Elder set sail across the bay and landed at Stabae, near to Pompeii. Despite the falling ash and fires in the distance, Pliny the Elder disembarked and stayed with his friends. He dined, bathed, and was sleeping when awakened by the increasing panic of those around him. The decision was made to leave, but Pliny the Elder was overcome by the ash and the fumes on the shore. His body was found 2 days later, lying as if asleep. Pliny obviously thought highly of his uncle, but his letter described him in almost a contradictory sense. On one hand, he sped off on a mission of mercy, but upon reaching his friends, decided to take a more relaxed attitude, which ultimately had a fatal outcome for him. Pliny's second letter was in response to Tacitus wanting to know more about what happened, and in this letter, Pliny wrote of his own experience, how he was forced to leave Misenum due to the tremors, of the darkness and the falling ash. When he returned to his uncle's house, the skies had cleared, and he described a landscape covered in ash as if it was snow. Pliny was only 17 or 18 at the time, and his letter, as mentioned, was written to Tacitus decades later. But it included some details which weren't fully appreciated until the modern period, the description of the pine tree cloud being one such example. It was testament to the accuracy of his account. With that said, there is one aspect of his account of the eruption of Vesuvius which does need to be addressed, and this leads to a wider point I need to make about Pliny's letters. It's in Pliny's first letter to Tacitus that he provides the date of the 24th of August as when it all happened. You're probably aware of the debate on this, and I've discussed this in my episode on Pompeii. However, I'm going to leave the arguments about archaeology and ash dispersal patterns to look at an important point which is sometimes missed. The central issue is that we don't have any surviving original letters by Pliny. Instead, what we have are fragments and much later copies. The earliest set of copies we have date to the 5th century AD, and these weren't discovered until around 1500. What we do have, though, are fragments and copies of copies, sometimes different copies made at different times of the same letter spread across the intervening centuries. An issue you've probably realised already is where we have differences in these copies. Pliny's account of Vesuvius, which gives that famous date, is one example of this. In some copies of that letter, the date is different, in others, absent. That's why we have a date, but also don't. If Schrodinger's cat had a birthday, it would be the 24th of August, but it also wouldn't be. And just before I continue, it wasn't until the early 14th century that it was realised that there were in fact 2 Plinys and not just one. It's a good example of how we can have an expectation that the knowledge we have today was consistently held from the times of antiquity. In reality, a lot was lost and then rediscovered in the centuries following. Pliny the Elder left the younger Pliny everything in his inheritance, and this included his name, hence Pliny the Younger. Given what he now had, it might have been tempting to live a life of relative luxury. I know that's what I would have chosen, but thankfully Pliny was made of more ambitious stuff. At the age of 18, he was in Rome and beginning a legal career in the Centum Virile Court, or Court of 100 Men. This court dealt with wills, inheritance and fraud. Pliny's rhetorical abilities shone, helped no doubt by the early tutoring he'd received from Quintilian, a famous teacher of rhetoric. Many of Pliny's later letters pick up on the art of speaking, whether it be reviewing his own speeches, the speeches of others, or attending speeches. Though he had a love of poetry and writing, it seems he was a real nerd for the art of speaking. The Centum Virile Court was no doubt a tough and competitive arena. Pliny's next role was as challenging, but in a very different context. The Gallic Third Legion had been formed under Julius Caesar and, as its name suggests, was recruited in the north of Italy. The Gallic Third had moved to Syria under Mark Antony, and in AD 45, the Emperor Claudius had settled some of its veterans in modern-day Acre. The legion became strongly associated with the East, and its soldiers adopted Eastern customs. This was to have a fortuitous outcome in a battle during the year of the 4 emperors. At the Second Battle of Bedriacum in October of AD 69, the Gallic Third fought alongside other legions which had backed Vespasian against the forces of Vitellius, the current emperor. The battle had extended through the night, but as the sun rose, the Gallic Third started cheering. This was a custom they had picked up from their time in the east. The Vitellian army thought that this was because reinforcements for Vespasian had been sighted, and they panicked. Their lines broke and they retreated. The cheering from the Gallic Third had won the day. When Pliny came to join the Gallic Third, they were back in the east in modern-day Syria. Here, he was a military tribune responsible for the administration and specifically the financial side of things. In a later letter, Pliny described going through the accounts to ensure that there was no fraud or discrepancies, something which was more common than you might think. Pliny's next career was a step up in what's often referred to as the cursus honorum. This can be loosely described as the political ladder. If you wanted to get to the top, there are a series of rungs to climb. In AD 90, when he was still in his late 20s, Pliny became a quaestor. This was an elected magistrate whose main role involved conducting audits and overseeing the state treasury. It wasn't just a move up the career ladder, it was also a move up the social ladder, because Pliny was entered into the senatorial class. The senatorial class required a property requirement and nominations. Pliny must have been held in high regard. Pliny's climbing of the social and political ladder had occurred under the Emperor Domitian, who ruled from AD 81 to AD 96. Under Domitian, Pliny was made both prefect of the treasury and a tribune, again both important positions. And here we meet what can be best described as an awkward truth, because Domitian came to be highly unpopular with the Senate. After his assassination in AD 96, the Senate condemned him. Pliny wasn't alone. Both historians Suetonius and Tacitus, who Pliny exchanged letters with, had also worked under Domitian. Both had nothing but bad words to say about him. In Suetonius' work The 12 Caesars, he is depicted as the worst type of tyrant. We don't have the section of Tacitus which covered his reign, but in his work Agricola, he gives a damning portrayal, noting that, and I quote, "Even Nero withdrew his eyes from the cruelties he commanded." End quote. The question of whether Domitian was a tyrant has been a debated point in more recent times. In fact, you can listen to the excellent Domitian fangirl herself, L.J. Trafford, in an episode called AD 69 and Daily Life in Ancient Rome, where I challenged her to make a case for Domitian being a decent emperor. And I have to admit it was a very good case. Why then did the Senate hate Domitian? What had he done to cause that reaction, and now place Pliny and others in such an awkward situation? The unpopularity was largely the result of some prosecutions of senators and their families, as well as Domitian's attitude towards the Senate towards the end of his reign. For Pliny, though, we can be a bit more specific, and it related to a culmination of events in AD 93. It was then that Domitian had responded to what he saw as provocative moves by a faction made within the Senate, the Stoics, otherwise known as the Stoic opposition. They were named after the school of philosophy which they largely followed, and Pliny had become associated with a number of them. This wasn't a new thing. Under Vespasian, Domitian's father, a famous Stoic senator called Helvidius Priscus had been exiled and then executed. Priscus had now sort of risen from the grave to become a thorn in the side of another Flavian emperor, Domitian, and this took the form of a biography of his and another Stoic, which was published. The response was suitably brutal. It had been the widow of Priscus, named Fannia, who'd organised this. She was exiled. The two authors of the biographies, both senators, were prosecuted and executed. Even the stepson of Fannia was executed for a farce he had written which Domitian took offence to. When Pliny published his letters, there were several which looked to clarify his role in all of this, and I mean his lack of a role. Perhaps he felt guilty for surviving. Perhaps he wanted to ensure that people didn't question his loyalty to his friends. In a bad bit of timing, he had been promoted to praetor, a very senior position, in the same year as this was all going down. A worry Pliny had then was that he might be viewed as somehow complicit. He was being rewarded, while others were being punished. Several of his letters sought to address this directly. There were ones where he had written about his support for Fannia while she was exiled and upon her return after the death of Domitian. Another letter mentioned how he had courted danger staying with Artemidorus, a philosopher who had been banned by Domitian. Pliny even wrote to Tacitus with an account of an important court case and asked if Tacitus might include it in his work. His partner in the legal case was one of the biographers who had been executed by Domitian. A final example was the inclusion in a letter where Pliny had found a document in the desk of Domitian after his assassination. It was from Carus, who had accused and prosecuted one of the biographers, and it denounced Pliny. The implication was that had Domitian lasted much longer, Pliny would have been the next name on the list. The letters give the impression of Pliny as a bystander who was unable to do much to save his friends. More importantly, they underline how he didn't benefit from any of this. He wasn't about to throw his friends under the bus to improve his position. These letters dovetail with the criticism of Domitian made years later when he was a consul under Trajan, made in a speech. In this, he called Domitian the most treacherous of emperors, and named himself as one who had lived back then in grief and fear. For both Tacitus and Suetonius, the question is, to what extent were their accounts of Domitian balanced? Were they formed purely out of a personal experience of him? Was there an element of survivor guilt? Their works were published long after Domitian was gone, and their treatment of Domitian has that unique dynamic to it. Both had done well under a supposedly tyrannical ruler. Perhaps it was useful to clarify their opinion of him for a number of reasons. After Domitian, there was the Emperor Nerva, who only reigned for a few years, and following him it was Trajan. Under Trajan, Pliny's career soared to new heights. In AD 100, he became consul for a few months. He was only 38. It was a few years later, in AD 103, when Pliny began to publish the letters which form the 9 books published in his lifetime. We have 247 of these which have survived, but as I mentioned, not the originals. And even these weren't probably the originals that he'd written in years previous. These were in fact the ones that have been redrafted, edited, and given a bit of a rhetorical polish. Pliny continued with his legal career, prosecuting 2 ex-governors for corruption. One was Julius Bassus, who had overseen the province of Bithynia and Pontus. Trajan was keen to utilise Pliny, making him an augur and curator of the Tiber. This involved overseeing the sewers in Rome and the flood defences. It might not sound like much of a job, but both of these aspects were of high importance. Rome had always suffered from floods, and Pliny seems to have had a good ability with pairing the practical with the economic. Trajan would have known that anything done under him would have been stable in the physical sense and on the balance sheet. Pliny's career so far had evidenced his expertise as a financial troubleshooter and someone who could be relied on with large projects, including infrastructure. His next role was to incorporate these elements on a much larger scale than he'd previously experienced. The province of Bithynia and Pontus was a province formed from initially 2 separate regions, which hug the northern coast of modern-day Turkey. This was a senatorial province, meaning the Senate would normally choose the governor, but it seems that Trajan lent heavily on Pliny being chosen, and around 109 BC he arrived to fix what was a broken province which had been thoroughly mismanaged. Financial black holes and poor infrastructure were endemic. As such, you can see why he was such a good choice. Book 10 of his letters covered his time there, and this book is sometimes held separately from books 1 to 9 for 2 main reasons: that they were published after his death, and that they were exclusively about his time there and his correspondence with one individual, the Emperor Trajan. But just pause there. This book has replies from a Roman emperor. One of these exchanges is famous, although at the time it was just one of many issues Pliny had to field. Not a broken aqueduct, but what to do with this bunch calling themselves Christians. Christians were just another problem for Pliny, but not one he'd encountered before. He wrote to Trajan informing him of his current approach to them. Anyone who still responded they were a Christian after being questioned on this several times was sent to prison. The implication here is that this meant execution of some sort, as Pliny mentioned how if any were also Roman citizens, they'd be sent to Rome. Executing Roman citizens required special authorization. This left two groups to be dealt with. The first was those accused who denied ever having been a Christian. These were easily dealt with. After performing a sacrifice to the Roman gods and denouncing Christianity, they were let go. This left the final group, those who were once Christians but weren't anymore. It was this group that Pliny wanted clarification of what to do with. Trajan's reply was succinct. Keep doing what you're doing, but don't go actively hunting Christians. The emperor also added an important point. Don't go trusting or responding to any accusers or pamphlets. Pliny had mentioned in the letter that names of potential Christians had been suggested to him and also circulated on such a pamphlet. This was almost a separate issue, as the role of accusers or informers was often a dangerous thing, as people will start accusing others for all sorts of reasons. Trajan knew that this could end up causing social disorder, and so wanted to ensure that it wasn't made a valid practice. Aside from the perspective of policy, Pliny's letter carried details about the Christians and what they got up to from his investigations. They would meet before daybreak, recite a hymn to Christ, and then swear an oath ensuring that they would not commit any crime and abstain from robbery, theft, adultery, and a breach of faith. The Christians used to meet later in the day, but they had stopped because of an edict in the region prohibiting such types of meetings. Rome had long been concerned over societies and groups forming and being places where political dissent might form. In fact, Pliny wrote to Trajan requesting a fire brigade to be set up in Nicomedia following some fires there. A sensible request, you might think. But Trajan denied the request, stating that in the region there were factions, and I quote, and that such associations might degenerate into secret societies, end quote. Pliny had even anticipated this and written how he'd oversee the brigade, but it was still too risky in the opinion of Trajan. The Christians themselves don't seem to have posed much of a threat, or at least not one that rang any bells with Pliny. His main concern was the role of accusers and informers. He even blew his own trumpet by concluding that the actions taken had already seen people returning to the traditional forms of worship. The letter has been viewed as a critique of Pliny, that it showed him unable to deal with the situation, and confusingly asking for guidance whilst already undertaking actions. Well, that's one way to look at it. Another is that Pliny was playing a very clever game. True, Pliny does ask for guidance for that specific group of ex-Christians, but the letter can be read as more outlining his policy with a question to ensure a response. Pliny states in the letter that his preference with regards to the ex-Christians was to let them return to traditional worship. Read this way, it was a clever tactic of having Trajan sign off on what he was already doing. Why would he want to do this? Well, Pliny had been involved in the prosecution of ex-governors. Perhaps he feared that anything he did in the region might be scrutinized, and as such he now had a letter from Trajan confirming that what he was doing was with imperial knowledge and approval. Pliny never faced any prosecutions because, sadly, it doesn't seem as if he made it back to Rome. His death is given at around AD 113, and it was either in his province or on his way back. Even though he was in his early 50s, he'd had a truly remarkable career, and his letters help us understand this, but they do much, much more. The letters allow us to understand Pliny as well as the world he was living in, and as I come to the end of the episode, I want to talk about what more the letters can tell us about him, what he loved, what he didn't, who he hated, and some random bits from some of the letters. Let's start with the loves. He loved literature, particularly speeches, which seemed to be something he was very good at. Speech writing and rhetoric was a hardy craft. You might spend several hours in court giving one single speech, so it was a very developed skill. In his letters, he often discusses a visit to watch someone giving a speech or talking about the speeches of his and others that he knew about. He spent time drafting and writing speeches in villas, and 2 of these are described. Pliny's Tuscan villa was luxurious, and he described in detail the different trees, the gardens, which included box hedges clipped into shapes. He was also a keen gardener. In one letter he wrote how he enjoyed getting to know each fruit tree and vine. His Laurentine villa near Ostia was more austere, and though gardens aren't described, the surrounding woods and the nearby CR, and he delighted in both of them. The villas offered Pliny a space outside of Rome and somewhere which may have reminded him of his upbringing in Novum Comum. Being more of a country boy than a city boy, Rome was more tolerated than anything else. Perhaps this coupled with the sort of work he undertook and led him to remark, and I quote, "the din, the futile bustle, and the useless occupations of the city." End quote. Aside from Pliny, I wonder how many others who were born outside of Rome and who ended up there had similar thoughts about working in such a busy place. His hometown of Novum Comum featured in numerous letters. In one letter, he stated that he'd gifted it 1.6 million sesterces. Much of this was to improve the educational facilities, and this perhaps links back to his experience growing up there. He'd been lucky enough to have a tutor, and he mentions how he was inspired to help fund tutors there after hearing how one family had to send their son to nearby Mediolanum, modern-day Milan, some 40 kilometres to the south, for education. In AD 96 or 97, he had a library built there and donated 100,000 sesterces each year for its maintenance. He also spent a large amount to source teachers for the free-born young, both boys and girls. His generosity wasn't just to strangers. A childhood friend was loaned 300,000 sesterces so he could qualify for the rank of equestrian. He even bought what he hoped was a genuine antique Corinthian bronze sculpture, which he wanted to have put in the Temple of Jupiter. Sadly, it's not been found, so we don't know if it ever made it there. In his letters, Pliny deals with a range of characters. In fact, he wrote to over 100 different people, but one receives more vitriol than everyone else put together. Allow me to introduce to you Marcus Aquilius Regulus. Regulus had been an informer under Nero, and even in the time of Pliny, he was associated with, let's say, the darker arts of the legal profession, particularly involving wills, where he'd attempt to manipulate the wealthy into leaving himself something. Of course, this was an area of specialization for Pliny, so he well knew those dark arts, and he must have hated Regulus even more for it. If this wasn't enough, Regulus was also involved in the prosecution of Fannia under Domitian. Pliny gave an account of him, and I quote, "He has weak lungs, he never looks you straight in the face, he stammers, he has no imaginative power, absolutely no memory, no quality at all, in short, except a wild, frantic genius. And yet, thanks to his effrontery, and even to this frenzy of his, he has got people to regard him as an orator." End quote. Even when Regulus lost his son, Pliny didn't believe any of his mourning was genuine. And when Regulus himself met his end, Pliny wrote in a letter about his memories of him, and noted that, and I quote, "Regulus did well to die, and he would have done better still if he had died earlier." End quote. That's just savage. If you think about Pliny's letters as a series of photos, you can consider what he's showing us in the foreground. But there's a lot of detail in the background, and that for me is equally as important. It's through his letters that we get descriptions of how things worked. Take patronage, for example, where several letters are Pliny recommending people for a variety of roles. There are the dry legal technicalities, the small cogs of the legal system revealed to us, how court hearings worked and how strategies were mapped to them, a sort of easier to understand IKEA instruction manual. But there's also the random stuff, a letter where Pliny fumes about how a host kept the good wine at a meal for those close to him and served everyone else much cheaper fare, the annoyance at how people fidget at speech recitals, his love of nature, and a mysterious pool which emptied itself and then refilled. A famous tale involving a dolphin which saved a boy and allowed itself to be ridden. The dolphin became a tourist attraction and was then, let's say, removed when it got too popular. Pliny's ghost story is one I have featured in my Halloween episodes, and where we get the trope of a spirit haunting a house whilst moaning and rattling its chains. These are just some of those, and I'm sure moments after I stop recording and start packing away my notes, I'll be kicking myself for not mentioning other instances. If you're looking to learn about Rome, particularly if you're studying it, I suggest you read a couple of letters a day. It will build up your background knowledge, and though there are centuries between us and Pliny, many of his letters have moments where something will resonate, and for me, that's another layer of their beauty. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this brief overview of Pliny and his life and some of his letters. If you get to read any of them, let me know what you think of them. And until next time, take care and keep safe.